An investigation continues after police broke up a human trafficking ring north of Toronto. Police say 64 people from Mexico were forced to work at farms, factories, and warehouses.
The foreign laborers described incidents of false promises, which included documentation, quality of housing, their work hours, and their pay.
Police arrested 5 people earlier in February. 2 more are still being sought. Investigators say the victims were housed in deplorable conditions and that some endured threats and sexual assault. For more on this, we are joined now by Syed Hussan. He is the Executive Director of Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, and he joins us from Vancouver. Thanks so much for giving us some time today.
Thank you for having me.
Can we start by describing, so you can help us understand, the situation these 64 workers were in? What were the living and working conditions?
So these are workers who were being paid below minimum wage. They were working long hours and they're not getting overtime pay. They were not getting public holidays off and paid sick days. But the reality is what they were facing is actually a very common part of our labor system. Every week, we and our sister organizations are getting hundreds of calls from people who are immigrants, migrants, who are working in these exact same situations. This is the unfortunate reality of our labor system, that these kinds of everything that they are facing is unfortunately quite common.
And I want to ask you more about the systemic problems that may exist. But first of all, when it comes to these workers, now that arrests have been made, what happens to them? Are some of them going to have to go back home?
So there's a huge problem that the police are involved because this is a standard labor violation. This is a bad boss treating workers badly. And the only way for workers to have standing is to go through the Ministry of Labor. The police, on the other hand, can't do anything. The police can maybe lay charges against some people who may be convicted of a crime, but there's no tools there to get money or reparations or justice back to the workers themselves, and that's the problem. This needs to be treated like a civil issue with the Ministry of Labor involvement. This whole charade of calling it a rescue or framing it with this big media event is a misrepresentation of what's actually happening and will not result in any changes for the workers themselves. The workers may get a temporary resident permit if they are deemed to be human trafficked, which actually is a very difficult thing to get, which is a permit that will last 6 months and then will have to be renewed and may not be renewed. If they don't get that, they'll become undocumented and they'll be either forced to leave the country or live here without status.
What role does the employer have in this? We are told that they were working on farms and factories. Surely there must be a role and a responsibility for those who were employing these workers.
Absolutely. So what it is a recruiter chain. So the workers paid an agency in Mexico who brought them to Canada, housed them, and then they were working for an employer. So for the last 15 years, in fact, we have been trying to push the Ontario government to create a system where the employer is responsible. A law was passed now 2 years ago and has not been implemented that would hold the employer responsible for the recruiter chain. They would have to be registered to use correct recruiters. But consecutive Liberal and Conservative governments have simply failed to implement this law. In BC, in Manitoba, in PI, in Nova Scotia, these laws have been passed but have not been fully implemented either. So while it is, in fact, should be the employer's responsibility, the laws simply refuse to hold them accountable, which is why this kind of stuff keeps happening and is very normal, which is why I don't understand why it's being framed as a rescue or a policing operation at all. It is immigration law and labor law that effectively makes most of these practices legal.
I can hear the frustration in your voice, and you're painting a clear picture that this is something that happens all the time in this country. So boil it down for us. What has to happen next? Is it at the federal level with laws? Is it police enforcement? Is it better regulation for the employers? Or is it all of the above?
So federally, we need a system of full and permanent immigration status. We met with these workers. We supported some of them to exit the situation in advance before the police weirdly got involved. And the reason they weren't speaking up is because they didn't have permanent resident status. As long as low-wage people in this country don't have path to permanent resident status, they will continue to be treated like that. So that is the first thing. The second thing is the Ontario law to pass to get to the point where provincial law might in all of the labor laws and practices necessary. Because in fact, We don't know if these people are included in basic labor laws like minimum wage and overtime pay and hours of work yet. But frankly, the police should not get involved. They're basically doing this charade to spend all their money and use their toys and framing it as a rescue. People don't need to be rescued. They need their rights, and that's status for all and labor employment rights.
I'm almost out of time, but I just want to pick up on that one more time because you call it weird and you're implying that it's an over-exaggeration that the police got involved. We understand that it was a tip from one of these migrant workers that led to this police investigation of a couple of months or so. Why, when we're hearing police were also horrified and very affected by what they saw in bed-bug-infested beds and sleeping conditions, sometimes 2 to a mattress, dozens in a room, reports of sexual assault, why should police not be involved in something like that?
Because this is how our labor system works. All seasonal agricultural workers in this country are put in warehouses in bunk beds 2 atop each other. Sexual assault is happening. I'm not saying they're right. I'm saying the police has no space or no tools to deal with this. The workers cannot get any of the money they're owed because of the police's involvement, because it's the Ministry of Labor that determines what happens there, not policing. Absolutely, one of the workers left and called the police, but other workers left and came to us and they went to other places. And the police then, yes, did a month investigation, but instead of knocking on the door and talking to workers or the Ministry of Labor going in and saying, hey, let us tell you about your rights, let us help you file a complaint. They did this huge raid, they picked up people, they put them in hotels. We don't know how long they'll stay. They're getting this third-party support around TRPs. This is not a policing matter. This is, if the police were raiding every bad employer where wages are not being paid, the last report said over 40% of minimum wage workers in Ontario are not getting all of their wages. Sure, if you think that's the police's job, but it isn't, and they don't have any tools for this matter. And this is just a way for the police to get a lot of media attention, and it doesn't help the workers. The workers are not getting the money they're owed because the police simply can't do it. That's it. That's the problem. And we should not be distracted or talking about human trafficking because we need to change immigration and labor laws, and involving the police makes it feel like there's a few criminal bad actors whereas the reality is most of this stuff is borderline legal.
You've certainly painted a clear picture and given us a lot to think about, and we know that migrant workers certainly play a huge role in this country's economy. Many farms, factories, small businesses rely on them. I want to thank you so much for your time today on this matter.
Thank you so much for having me.
Syed Hussain, Executive Director of Migrant Workers Alliance for Change.